One of the things that I always encourage hosts to do is to also remember that like they are a part of the conversation too, right? Like somebody falls in love with the podcast normally because they love the hosts and what the hosts are bringing to the table. So if a guest says something that you're like, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, then you should say that. And or if you have a follow-up question, you should say that. Or yeah, just remember like you can pop in whenever you want. It's your show and there's no rules on podcasting.
Hi, welcome to Curious Conversations, a podcast for kids by kids. I'm one of your hosts, Xavier.
And I'm your other host, Emma. And we're so excited to bring you another season of interesting discussions with people from all walks of life to learn about their passions and what inspires them.
We are still as curious as ever, and we hope you will join us on our journey. Hi everyone, today we are super excited to talk with Kattie Laur. She's a podcaster, producer, and the creator of Pod the North, a really cool newsletter all about the Canadian podcast scene. Basically, she knows a lot about podcasting. This was such a fun conversation because it was the first time we got to chat with another podcaster about, well, podcasting. Kattie shared some awesome advice, told us what she loves about making podcasts, and even talked about some of the challenges that come with it. If you ever thought about starting a podcast or just want to know what goes on behind the mic, this episode is for you. So let's get into it.
Hi, Katie. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. It's so funny joining a call with two people at the exact same time.
Yeah.
What grade are you guys in?
Grade 9.
Grade 9. Ooh, okay. Yeah. First year of high school, hardcore.
Yeah. So, Katie, you've been in the podcasting industry for a while. You're a podcast producer and the author of Pod the North, a newsletter for Canadian podcasters. So, before we get into all that, do you remember the first podcast you listened to?
Oh, yeah. I remember it very vividly. It feels like it wasn't that long ago because podcasting hasn't been that popular for very long. But I remember, I think I was on a treadmill or like on an elliptical at the time. And I decided to just hit play on this podcast called Reply All. And it was this guy looking into like who is behind all of those scammy phone calls that you get. So he actually tracked down this huge company who is based in India. And he went to India, found all of these people who worked for this company and discovered like the scammy people behind all of this stuff. It was nuts. And that just opened up a whole world of like storytelling and everything you could do with audio. It was crazy. So I remember this very well.
Wow, that's insane. I wonder how he got that idea.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously people would listen to that.
Yeah,
Wow.
It was basically just a podcast where a guy was like, how the heck does technology work? And why are these things happening? And then decided, listen, I'm a journalist. I could probably figure this all out. And then did.
Oh, yeah. Best podcasts start with curious people. So,
That's
yeah.
really interesting.
Definitely.
So we would like to know a little bit more about Pod the North. Why did you start it, and why did you decide to focus on Canadian podcasting?
Ooh, I mean, I definitely have an answer for this that I've talked about a bunch, but I'm starting to question how much the two of you, a couple of grade 9s, will care about it. But basically, I will. I just worked in podcasting, or I was desperate to work in podcasting for a long time. I mean, by grade 12, I was like, I definitely want to work in radio. I went through all of university and was like, yeah, I'm definitely going to work in radio for sure. This is the game plan. I graduated and I did not get a job. And I was like, what the heck? So I applied for jobs over and over and over again after graduating, couldn't find any. Finally did find some, which was me making my own work. I decided to just find some clients who would pay me to make them podcasts. And then I was like, listen, why is this so hard? Why am I a talented producer? I learned all this stuff from school, but like nobody's giving me jobs. Nobody's emailing me back. I don't even know what is going on here. So basically by meeting people in Canadian podcasting, I realized that everybody sort of felt the same way. Everyone was like, I don't know what's going on here. And I feel like my talent isn't being sort of showcased or nobody even knows I exist. So that's what brought me to Pod the North, which was basically a mission to connect the Canadian podcasting ecosystem and making sure that like people who are just making podcasts for fun, like you guys, or people who are doing it on like a professional level and getting paid by people, all feel like they know what's going on around here and can find each other as resources and hire each other and just make it easier to exist here.
Wow, that's certainly a lot. I mean, that's you took a kind of a big hole in the kind of Canadian podcasters, and you kind of tied us all together, which I think a lot of us will be thankful for, because
Yeah.
it's kind of
Hopefully.
nice to know and like learn and rebound ideas off each other. And that newsletter is definitely just it's going to start a whole community. I have a feeling
helps people connect.
That's the plan. And you're totally right too, Emma, because I started the newsletter thinking like, listen, I think only like a couple of my friends are going to read this. It's mostly just me ranting and complaining. And then all of a sudden it just exploded and a whole bunch of people really resonated with it. And it's been around for about 2 years and it's kind of kicked off the ground more than I expected it to. I got a bunch of speaking gigs from it over the last couple of years. I did a live event a couple of years ago to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of it. Got CBC Podcasts involved. It's kind of picked up off the ground more than I expected. So hopefully everything you just said is going to come to fruition one day.
Hopefully.
I will, for sure. So it seems like you have a bit of everything when it comes to podcasts. Like you just said, you kind of started off like just kind of like helping a few people out. So like through your whole experience working in the podcasting industry, what do you love most about it? And what's your favorite thing about it?
Well, I think if you can't tell already, I love talking. I love talking to people about podcasts. I love talking on podcasts. And along with that, I think I have a lot of just creativity that I like to express in some capacity. And podcasting was so fun because like you could just do whatever you wanted. There's really no rules in podcasts. Like you might think if you want to work in radio, you have to work for a big company. But turns out you can make radio on demand for anybody to listen to and just do your own thing and you don't have to find a job. It's still hard to get paid in podcasting though. So that takes work. But yeah, what I love so much about it is just like, I love just being a part of the creative process and also finding like really important stories and things that people are talking about that I think are valuable in the world and helping them grow audiences around them. So that's the work that I do now, is around like building audiences and building communities. But yeah, I think I've always had like a bit of a justice streak in me, and I've always sought out like good things for people. And when I see that people have important things to say, then I want to make sure that people hear those things.
I mean, totally. I think in the next coming years, podcasts are definitely going to like be on the increase. They already are.
Oh yeah.
Especially kind of like with radio. I think podcasts are kind of almost surpassing it. And it's really important for everyone to kind of get something to say because everyone can learn something from someone else.
Absolutely.
Totally.
And that's amazing, like trying to connect different people.
Thanks. It's hard. It's a lot of work. I'm definitely like tired all the time. I will say that, but I can't help it. When you feel like you can't help but do something, it just happens.
It always feels better when you can help.
Totally. Yeah.
That's awesome, obviously. But even just hosting a podcast, we know that it's not always easy. So what's the most challenging thing about working in podcasting?
That's such a big question, Xavier. As specifically as a host or in like making a podcast? What are you the most curious about?
In both.
Okay. I think like in hosting a podcast, I think it's hard to stay in the moment and like listen to your guest while also thinking about how to like make an interesting conversation and drive a narrative through the conversation that you're having. So sometimes you have like a plan of questions that you're going to ask somebody, but then somebody kind of goes on another tangent that might be more interesting than the questions that you've planned. And making that judgment call in the moment is kind of like distracting at the same time. So yeah, that's the toughest part about hosting a podcast, I think, is like like staying in the moment, but also deciding what's the most interesting and also sticking to the game plan, because if you work in this field and you have a producer or a whole team behind you, they've probably spent a lot of time doing research for you and writing interview questions for you. And so you don't want to completely abandon everything that they've prepared. You got to stay a team player too. So yeah, those are the hardest parts of hosting. And then in terms of producing, let's say, I mean, there's so many different ways to approach this, but let's talk about it in terms of like deciding on what sort of topic to do for a podcast episode. I mean, when you start a podcast, you might have millions of ideas, or you might think you have a really good idea until you think about all the episodes you can do. And you're like, wait, I think that's only good enough for one episode. Like, I don't think we have much more than this. So, figuring out like what the mission of your podcast and if there's enough in there to make a show, an interesting show, can be really challenging. And it can be like a long conversation with teams that you have. I don't know. Maybe you've had this conversation with your mom already. So I know she's a podcast producer, and I'm sure she's got lots of great ideas for the show too. And you guys have different ideas. So sometimes like having that collaborative team, you have to figure out, all right, like when am I going to just step back and let somebody else's idea go forward, or how hard am I going to push for my ideas? And when do I know that something is a compelling pitch? Lots of things in that there.
Well, yeah, it's certainly a lot of work. I say hosting and producing podcasts.
Yeah, you guys would know.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
yes.
for hosting specifically, I mean, I think the best part about what makes a good podcast is kind of like you said, a balance of good questions and letting your guests go on a tangent about interesting things, because at the end of the day, they're the expert. But I think that's just kind of a unique dynamic between host and guests, like just exactly like you pointed out, because you kind of keep them on track, but they're the expert and they're the one making the show interesting.
Yeah. I'll add too, one of the things that I always encourage hosts to do is to also remember that like they are a part of the conversation too, right? Like somebody falls in love with the podcast normally because they love the hosts and what the hosts are bringing to the table. So if a guest says something that you're like, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, then you should say that. And or if you have a follow-up question, you should say that. Or yeah, just remember, like you can pop in whenever you want. It's your show and there's no rules on podcasting.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, the host is what makes like your audience and viewers consistent. And in terms of producing, I mean, obviously we don't know much, but our mom, she produces lots of podcasts, and I think probably the most important thing is she's the same dynamic we have with her and all her other like podcasts, is that just a lot of good collaboration, and like all these like-minded people coming into a room, there's always good ideas coming out of it, which I think is almost the beauty of podcasts.
Totally. Yeah. I think they call it like a very democratic space where it's
Of
open to a
course.
lot of different types of open opinions. And yeah, I keep saying it, but like there's no rules in podcasting. It's so true. Like it's still such an early medium that you can just kind of experiment and decide what you want on the fly and see if it works and resonates with your audience. And then if it doesn't, you can go back to the way that you were doing things. And it's not that big a deal.
Just earlier, you were talking about like tips for hosts specifically, but what is your advice around building an audience, a podcast audience, and a community, especially for independent podcasters? Because you kind of making a connecting community within hosts with your newsletter, but how do you kind of build a podcasting audience, a community within your audience?
Totally. I think first and foremost, the question you have to ask yourself is like, who is this podcast for? And you can think about it as even as visually as like, okay, somebody is clicking play on this podcast and they're thinking to themselves, oh my God, finally, I found a podcast that's exactly for me. Well, who is that person? What do they like? What are they up to every day? You don't even have to think about like how old they are. Sometimes that's important, and sometimes their gender might be important. But normally, it's just a matter of like what their interests are and what their values are. And so, think about like who that person is for, and then now that you know who that ideal person is, where do they exist in the world? Usually there's a lot of other podcasts out there that might have a very similar audience to you. And so you can start to do like strategizing around like, maybe I should be a guest on that podcast too and try and tap into that show. There's a couple of different ways that you can collaborate with other podcasts. But then also you can go to like events where those people are. Maybe sometimes that's a podcast conference, but maybe let's say you make a travel podcast. Maybe you go to a travel conference or you go to like some event where like a whole bunch of like people who just graduated from high school are looking to go on their trip around like Southeast Asia or something. And you go meet all these people there. So it depends on where your who you want your audience to be, and then some clever and creative thinking about where they exist in the world and how you can tap into that.
So you mentioned using podcasts for social good by like bringing people together. What do you mean by that?
Totally. Well, so I don't know if you guys know, but the world is kind of chaotic right now.
Absolutely.
Um, there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's all very stressful stuff. And the media has changed a lot since like I was growing up. Like their podcasts weren't, I mean, I'm 32 years old. I don't think I'm that old, but like just 10 years ago, there weren't very many podcasts out. Like radio was still a big thing. Even Spotify wasn't really a thing. Like we were illegally downloading music off the internet and listening to it on our iPod. Like media is just changing so fast. And so it's hard to know where to like trust information that's coming to you. And now I think like we're getting an understanding that like humans are humans. There's a variety of perspectives out there that like some you may severely disagree with and some you may very much advocate for. And podcasting has sort of landed into this like beautiful space of being able to showcase voices that are important and lend a variety of different perspectives. So I think like when it comes to podcasting for good, I would love to see more because of how accessible this medium is. Like for me, I'm 32 years old, so spending $150 on a microphone, like it's not that big of a deal for me, and it isn't for a lot of 32-year-olds. Maybe it's different for teenagers, I would assume, but typically podcasting isn't very expensive of a thing to do. It's a pretty accessible thing to just make on your own. Some people call it like a DIY kind of space, like a do-it-yourself space, and it's very reminiscent to me of like the 80s when people were making like underground punk music and stuff and just recording their stuff in their garages. All of that to say, like, you can make your own podcast pretty easily. And so I would hope that people are starting to use the medium of podcasting to spread good messaging. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that a lot in the podcasting space. So my advocacy around this is to get more people using their voices and more advocacy and more like money to those people who are using podcasts for good and for social justice. So that's where my head is at in terms of podcasting for good.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'd say it's so important to like podcasts. Just it's a beautiful tool, as you said, and using it for social good. It just makes sense as of right now,
right? It 100% makes sense.
Yeah. So you obviously like you kind of, especially with your newsletter, you know the ins and outs of the Canadian podcasting world. You know, like all these top podcasts. So you were just talking about social good. Can you give us some examples of some podcasts you think are podcasting for social good?
Ooh, great question. Love this. Okay, one of my favorite podcasts right now is a show called Tech Won't Save Us. You guys probably know how ingrained technology is like a part of our lives at this point. Like we can't, like I can't. I get so stuck in doom scrolling at this point. It's awful. So this podcast called Tech Won't Save Us, it looks at the podcast industry, like the whole global industry, and basically unpacks the idea that like tech billionaires can save us all, and that it takes like a lot more than just technology to like save the world. And so this host Paris Marks, they have different guests on who are like technologists or experts about whatever field that they exist in, and just have a variety of conversations that are just rooted in technology that's trying to like change the world and kind of looks at it critically. So I'll try and think of an example. One that I listened to was about how like easy and breezy traveling through airports has supposedly gotten, and how you can just like book your tickets online and everything. You barely even talk to a person when you travel at this point. Like it's crazy. You don't have to do anything. You even get like a robot to print your bag sticker and everything. But with that has come like a lot of sketchy things that the travel and airlines have been doing to like just basically make more money off of people, make traveling way less accessible, and make traveling like way more uncomfortable. So they not only have they've been like kind of getting rid of people working at these places and losing jobs, but they've also been making like like the space between chairs shorter so they can fit more seats in. They've been upselling people on how you have to pay for like a bag now, even just to carry on you have to pay for. So yeah, things like that this podcast is digging into, is like, what the heck is technology doing to our world, and what do we actually need to do to solve the problem that it's trying to solve?
Yeah, I think podcasts like that are just what the world needs. I mean, kind of bringing awareness to the general public about the issues technology is bringing, or just anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we were like, you talking about social good, and to like the listeners listening. I mean, we get some people are interested in starting a podcast, and I'm sure you get that all the time.
Yep.
So many times when we try to talk to them, they say they want to start one, and they sometimes have an idea, or sometimes even just a title they like. So as I said, this must happen to you all the time. So for anyone listening who's thinking about starting their own podcast, what advice would you give them?
Ooh, I would say there's a couple pieces of advice, so this might be a very lengthy answer for you, but I would say the first place to start is like listen to podcasts, I think, because there's a lot of people who think they're pretty funny out there and they're like, ha ha ha, I should start a podcast. And I'm like, I don't even, have you even listened to one before? Like, do you know what kind of format you would want to do? Because by listening to other podcasts, you get a better idea of what you like and what you don't like about other podcasts. You get just inspired by other shows to decide on how you want to do things. And that was a huge part of how I started my own podcast last year. I was really inspired by this one show called Normal Gossip. And I loved how they told stories on that. Basically, they get like anonymous gossip stories and then tell their guest this story. So you as the listener are just listening to this gossip story the entire time. And it's so funny. So I just find inspiration from podcasts that I listen to and things that I don't like. And then from there, like I mentioned already, think about like who your audience would be. And this is where like people who typically are like, I'm going to start a podcast, this is where they just shut down immediately because they didn't actually think about their audience. They just thought about how fun it'll be to like talk into a microphone, which is fun. I can confirm this. But when nobody's listening, like, does it really matter? Or are you just, is it kind of cringe that you're the only person like just talking into the ether and nobody's listening, right? So thinking about who your audience is like the next big chunk there. And then from there, think about like, can you make maybe 5 episodes out of this? Can you make 10 episodes out of this idea? If you can make only 6, maybe you can make a mini series and like leave it at that and then make something new. Like maybe you don't want it to continue on and on and on forever. Maybe you only want it to be a limited run. So think about how long you want it to last as well. And that'll give you also a measurable goal of what to go forward with. Because for my show that I launched last year called Canardian, I was like, I'm only going to do 12 episodes for this first season and then see how it goes from there. And then I decided to do another 12 episodes, which is what I'm currently working on. So I would say listen to podcasts, figure out who your audience is, see how long you want to do it for. And then, write a script and just record it.
That's great advice, and
Thank you.
And I can also confirm that it's so fun to talk to people and talk into a microphone.
Yeah.
But could you tell us more about your podcast?
Sure. So I mentioned that I was super inspired by that gossip podcast. There's a story about like a girls' trip who these girls just graduated from college and they decided to go on a Southeast Asia trip together. And the four of them decided they were each going to like split and plan apart a leg of their trip. And basically, they went through the first three legs until the last girl just disappeared, just dipped, and they didn't find out what happened until they looked at their phones and tracked her location, and she was at the airport headed home. Basically, she just got a free trip from
That's
her three friends
awful.
and then just like disappeared off the face of the planet. And just like, yeah, crazy stories like that. So yeah, humanity is messy. So this is what inspired my podcast. So I knew with Pod the North that I obviously love to support Canadian podcasters as much as I can. But I was like, a podcast just talking about podcasts, there's so many of those out there already. And the whole point of this is to like highlight their personalities. I want to make a podcast where people fall in love with other Canadian podcasters and then go listen to their show. So how do I do that? I'm going to make them talk about something that they can definitely talk about and share like really compelling stories about. To me, that is hometowns. So every episode of Canardian, I have a Canadian podcaster come on and we gossip about their hometown. I do a ton of research ahead of time to see what the internet is saying about this hometown. So I warn everyone that the podcast is not like credible. It is not like peer reviewed. It's not got like all these wonderful resources. The resources that I use for this show are Reddit, Facebook groups, weird articles online, just hearsay talking to people that I know from those hometowns. So yeah, I put together like a kind of some information about the general vibe of this hometown. And then I picked two main stories that I've uncovered about this hometown. So one of them recently was about uh, like a lantern music festival that took over the Six Nations Reserve, telling everybody that it was going to be hosted in Toronto until all these people showed up on the reserve and got kicked out. Things like that. So yeah, I think it's also opened up like a ton of interesting learnings that I've had about just the history of Canada. A lot of interesting context around just like how cities were formed here and all of the people that were displaced and or killed because of that. And I think it's like opened up a lot of important conversations around power and reconciliation in like some really fun ways. So yeah, that's what the show is doing. We're gossiping about Canadian hometowns with Canadian podcasters.
And you get the information from what people think about those hometowns?
Yeah, pretty much. So there's like Facebook groups are a gold mine for this content. People, boomers love to talk on Facebook groups and love to share their opinions. Oh, it's such good stuff to talk about on the show.
So you were talking a little bit about Pod the North there. Could we talk about a little bit a different part of Pod the North, and could you maybe give us a sneak peek on what's going to be the next edition of Pod the North?
Sure. So I'm working on Pod the North as a newsletter that I work on the side is chaotic. There's a lot of ideas that I have to write about, and there's a lot of things on the go all the time. So basically, every issue of Pod the North has sort of like a summary rundown of things that are going on in the ecosystem, just so everybody knows what's going on. But then there's also like a big piece that I write or I interview somebody about. So coming up, I am in the midst of writing a piece about what indie podcasters should do if a politician asks to be on their podcast, like how to approach that interview, why they might want to be on that podcast. Because for a lot of indie podcasters, like if a giant politician asks to be a guest on your show, it could be like, oh my God, what? Like, this is so flattering. Yes, please. Until you take a step back and realize like, why they truly are wanting to be there, what kind of questions you can actually get away with asking them. So that's a piece that I'm working on right now. And then I'm also working on, what else? There's some other exciting things. I like to dissect just like some of the big players and corporate entities here that you guys might not be as familiar with because you haven't been through the trenches yet, but just you wait. If you keep podcasting, you will. But yeah, just some fun pieces like that. That's the first one that I can think of off the top of my head.
So you said you like talking a lot, but you also seem very very passionate about writing. What's your favorite and why?
Ooh. Um There's a variety of different kinds of pieces that I write. This is the thing. So sometimes I write like what I think is just like DIY journalism is what I'll call it. So I'm super curious about a piece and I'll do interviews and then just kind of write an essay and put those interviews in between, sprinkled in between to just to prove my point or to prove a point. One of the ones that I did that I'm really proud of and that resonated with people a lot was our awards worth it for podcasters. There's a ton of podcasting awards out there, and a lot of them are based on like a popularity contest, basically, where basically the podcast with the biggest audience wins. They're going to get the most votes. There aren't a lot out there with like a judge and jurors who are judging the credibility of like how a story is told, how it's produced, and all of that stuff. So I did a deep dive into it and ended up finding out a little bit more about this one podcasting awards than I anticipated, and found out that one of these awards companies called the Webbies is making like, I don't know, almost $1 million off of like one award ceremony. And like really not doing much for the community. It's ultimately like people win when they have enough money to buy a trophy, basically. So I ended up unpacking it and finding out just how scammy some of these things can be. So that's one of my favorite pieces that I've unpacked and resonated with people the most. But then I've also been writing just some more creative stuff. Or just like sort of informed essays, I guess I'll call it informed, but air quotes for our listeners there. But I wrote a piece about how like branded podcasts might end up getting more chaotic if they end up kind of following the way that TikTok is going. And I know you guys have probably seen ads and sponsored content on TikTok a bunch and Instagram Reels, and you can see how chaotic those vibes can be, especially the profiles that are run by like brands. Like, I don't know if you've seen the Ryanair TikTok account or things like that, where there's just like 20-year-olds running these TikTok accounts that are representative of an entire huge brand, and just commenting like unhinged stuff in the comments, posting crazy things. And I was like, what happens if they get a hold of the podcasting space? So I did like a whole write-up about my thoughts about what could happen if we follow the chaotic vibes that seem to be doing so well for brands and what that could look like in podcasting. So yeah, those are a couple of my favorite pieces and somewhat recent ones too.
So that's crazy that the awards go to just not like the best podcast, but just the podcast that most people listen to.
Pretty much.
So, like, besides our podcast, do you have some other favorite independent podcasts that you love to listen to?
Yeah. Okay. Let me think about that for a second. So I mentioned Tech Won't Save Us. That's an independent podcast. And it's gotten so successful that the host, Paris Marks, and their producers, they're like just, they've gotten to build a career out of this stuff. Paris is also an author too. So they always go around the world and sort of talk about tech stuff. So that's a great independent podcast. There's another really good one about chess. And this is the thing, like you're never going to make a giant podcast for everybody. You're usually going to be making a podcast for like a very niche, engaged audience. My friend and her partner make a podcast called Rooked: The Cheater's Gambit. And it's an investigative, quote unquote, investigative podcast into the world of chess. And looking at this big scandal that happened like a whole bunch of years ago. It got so, like, for a while, people didn't really care about this because it's like just people who are into chess. Like, nobody's following the world of chess drama until Elon Musk got involved in it and started tweeting about it and making comments and like stirred up all this controversy around it.
Now everyone's involved.
Yeah, now everybody needs to know about chess. So, Jess and her partner Ryan end up doing some interviews to understand like the world of the chess culture. But it ends up being basically Ryan just trying to convince Jess to like chess. It's a really fun show. Every episode kind of unpacks a different theme that's existing in the world of chess. But it's also a really fun, just like not examination, just it shows their dynamic as a couple and as like a chess obsessed guy and a not so chess obsessed person. Like they just have a really fun dynamic talking about this. So that's another really good indie podcast.
Well, I love chess. It's awesome.
Oh, there you go. It's a great show. It's a great show, Xavier. You're gonna love it.
I should watch it or listen to it. Listen to it.
Oh, this has just been a fantastic interview. But before we go, we have one more question. What's the secret to a great interview just like this one?
Ooh, I mean, like you said, the confidence. You got to have confidence. I think a great interview follows some sort of like maybe narrative arc in some capacity. I think a great interview starts with the best questions first. Because especially in podcasting, you want to keep people around right from the jump. And a great interview feels like personal and personal to the guest, and like the interviewer actually cares. Mm-hmm. So yeah, those are all my tips.
They're amazing tips. You've obviously been around the block a few times for podcasting.
A couple of times, yeah.
Definitely add them.
Well, thank you so much. This has just been an amazing time. Yes. So eye-opening to the world of podcasts. I mean, you're obviously so passionate and like just so informed about the subject. I think like people could listen to you talk for hours about it. It's amazing. Thank you so much.
This is the thing. I could talk about it for hours. I don't know if people want to listen to it. And just because I can talk about things for hours doesn't mean I'm the best person. So always listen to different perspectives.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for your time. We had a lot of fun.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening, and I know all the shows you probably listen to say this, but if you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate the podcast.
Also, we would love to connect with you and hear your thoughts about our episodes. You can find us on Instagram or visit our website. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in.